Howdy folks, hope you all had a good weekend, and welcome to another episode of Mingles with Jingles. And honestly, I had absolutely no idea what I was going to talk about this week. I mean, it's been a fairly slow week, there's not been an awful lot happening. Saturday, for example, the one day off each week that I get, and normally I can sit down in front of the PC, I've got no distractions, I've got no videos to do, and I can just crack on and have a good solid day's gaming. And I just couldn't be bothered. I'd finished playing Dredge, which, by the way, is an amazing game. And there will be a video series on that coming up, because Bendy and the Dark Revival, I think, probably has one episode to go. I know most of you will be very happy to hear that, because most of you haven't watched it, and you can't wait for Wednesdays and Saturdays to be filled with something worth watching, but I enjoyed playing it. And again, it's one of those games where not many people watch it, but the ones that do watch it really, really enjoy it. So, fair enough. But yeah, it's coming to an end. But I'd finished playing Dredge on Friday, and I'd seen both of the... I know technically there are 3 endings, but there are only 2 that matter. So I'd seen both of the endings. I've completed not quite all of the achievements. There are 3 hidden achievements that I haven't unlocked. But I've caught every fish, every aberration of every fish. Most of you have no idea what I'm talking about. The point is, I had nothing to do. So I pretty much spent all Saturday just lying on the couch watching Netflix. And even that got boring after a while, and I ended up just going to bed early. And then Sunday, and I have to record Mingles with Jingles, and there's absolutely nothing to talk about. I mean, it's not that there hasn't been anything happening, it's just that there's been nothing happening that I even remotely give a shit about. I was checking through the PC gaming news websites, and there's just nothing interesting. And then, just as I was about to give up hope, I saw the news that Phil Spencer, the head of Xbox, has opened his mouth and said something stupid. And hooray, I've got something to talk about. Thank you, Phil Spencer, for being such a moron. It's not unusual that a video game executive opens their mouth and says something that's either stupid or a lie, or both. I say dumb shit all the time, but I'm not in charge of a multi-billion-dollar games publishing corporation, so, it doesn't have quite the same impact when I say something stupid, like the USS Austin doesn't have high explosive ammunition, for example. Yes, you all caught me out on that one. Sorry. But anyway, games publishing executives say dumb shit all the time. Take Activision's Bobby Kotick, for example, who was recently, as in, in the last week or so, was asked the question how he thought that AI like ChatGPT, for example, was going to affect the future of games development. And he clearly had no idea how to answer this question. But rather than giving an honest answer, which would have involved saying that he didn't actually know until the research was in, which would have been fine because nobody really knows until the research is in, but supplying an honest answer to the question would have possibly made it look as if he didn't know absolutely everything about absolutely everything, and you can't have that. He's Bobby Kotick, and so in the best traditions of senior business executives and every politician everywhere, he tried to bullshit his way through the answer to the question. He started talking about how he'd always had this vision for Guitar Hero, but then didn't bother to explain what the vision was and started mumbling about embedded processors. And if you've ever seen a politician confronted with a question that they clearly weren't prepared to answer on a news show, but then tried to answer it anyway, you know exactly how this went, right? He just kind of mumbled his way through a non-answer, and then after a minute of this continuous talking and filling the air with words that didn't actually mean or say anything, he sat there looking as if he just delivered the answer to life, the universe, and everything. So, yeah, thanks, Bobby. At least he wasn't outright lying. He was bullshitting, but not lying. There's a fine line between bullshitting and lying, but it's not unusual to have these senior publishing executives just outright lie to us as well. You want some examples? Here we go. Do you remember the USS Puerto Rico? A couple of years back, the dumpster fire of a Christmas dockyard event in World of Warships. Now, this wasn't the first time they'd introduced the dockyard feature into World of Warships. I can't remember which ship it was they did it with first, but it was doable. The idea was that you would play the game, complete various different challenges, and unlock shipbuilding stages in the dockyard. And it was absolutely possible to do this whole thing for free just by playing the game. Now, if you didn't want to wait, if you didn't want to grind out the missions and the challenges, then you could absolutely put your hand in your pocket and just pay to complete it. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's a free-to-play game after all. They have to have a way of putting bread on the table. But it was absolutely 100% possible to get the whole thing done for free without spending a penny. And I'm believe that's a 100% acceptable monetization policy in a free-to-play game. You give them something that they can do for free, you just make it hard. It's doable, but it's hard. So if people want to skip the grind, I mean, they can grind as much as they can, and then if they want it badly enough, by all means, allow them to buy their way to the finish line. Or even allow them to just buy it outright straight from the start. I mean, the point is you give the players the choice. And that's exactly what they did with the first Dockyard event. And I still can't remember which ship it was. Anyway, not important. The point is, it worked. It was very, very popular. People said this was great. More of this again in future, please. And so they got more of it again in future. Christmas that year, they announced a new Dockyard event, with the reward being the Tier 10 US Navy heavy cruiser, the USS Puerto Rico. But there was a little difference. It wasn't possible to get it for free. Now, Wargaming insisted that it was, but it wasn't. It was mathematically impossible for a human being to grind that ship out for free and not kill themselves in the process. So technically, maybe it was possible. Maybe, if you were the best World of Warships player in the world and you wanted to kill yourself doing it, it was possible to unlock the Puerto Rico for free. Which basically means it was impossible to unlock the Puerto Rico for free. To this day, of course, Wargaming have never admitted that it was impossible to do, even though it's been mathematically proven to be impossible to do. Instead, of course, rather than just admitting the truth, and perhaps adjusting the grind a little to make it at least theoretically possible to get the whole thing done for free, Wargaming doubled down on their lies and bullshit. I can't remember exactly who it was. I mean, I certainly couldn't remember his name. He was Russian. It's mostly unpronounceable for me, and I can't remember his exact position at Wargaming, but basically the head honcho, like Wargaming's managing director, then threw fuel on the fire by saying, and I'm not making this up, right. I don't know what's more insulting here, the fact that he actually said it or the fact that he thought everybody was stupid enough to believe him, but he said that they had made the grind for the Puerto Rico, as punishing as it was, as a Christmas present for all of those unemployed World of Warships fans who had nothing better to do over the holidays. They actually let him go in front of journalists and say this. But then what do? It's not like you can... I mean, he's your managing director. I mean, it's not like you can throw him under the bus and disavow his public statements and say, you know, he doesn't represent the company. He's the managing fucking director. So, of course, they doubled down again and backed him up and defended his comments. Oh, man. And, you know, it's not even as if anybody should have really been surprised that the second Dockyard event became as predatory as it was, because that's just what these companies do. It's not just Wargaming, they're all at it. Every time one of these publishers introduces a new feature into their games, it's never to make the game better, it's all just to see how far they can push the monetization, just exactly how much cash they can squeeze out of you before it becomes impossible to ignore that slapping noise, which is the publisher's balls smacking you in the ass every time they thrust it in. Eventually, at some point, the monetization will become so blatant that it just becomes impossible to ignore anymore. You're going to look over your shoulder and, Wargaming, what are you doing there? What's that slapping noise? Is that your balls hitting my ass cheeks every time you stick it in? At which point the publisher realises, oh shit, we've gone too far. And they pull it back just enough so that the slapping noise becomes easier to ignore, and the majority of the players will quite happily put up with it. Wargaming went too far with the USS Puerto Rico Dockyard event. It became impossible for the player base to ignore the fact that they were indeed being ass-fucked by the publisher. I think it's safe to say that Wargaming learned their lesson over that particular incident. Unfortunately, the lesson that they learned was to just try to shove it in by increments rather than trying to give you the whole 6 inches all at once. And while Wargaming are a big cheese in the free-to-play gaming market, as far as global games publishing goes, they're not nothing, but they're certainly not on the scale of companies like Bethesda, Take-Two, Ubisoft, Activision, or Electronic Arts. So, I mean, the gaming news certainly picked up on the whole Wargaming story, but there was next to no mainstream media interest. In order to generate mainstream media interest, you basically have to be somebody like Activision, Ubisoft, or Electronic Arts. And to be fair to Wargaming, they were really only following where Electronic Arts was leading the way. Oh yes, the Star Wars Battlefront 2 loot box fiasco. Oh yes. the Star Wars Battlefront 2 loot box fiasco, where Electronic Arts tried, well, they didn't try anything, they did push the aggressive and predatory microtransactions and pay-to-win mechanics in a full-price video game so egregiously that even a free-to-play publisher would have been shamefaced. And they didn't just test the waters by shoving it in by increments either. They gave you the whole 6 inches without the benefit of even pretending to lube up first. And then lied about it in such an obviously transparent and pathetic manner that not only did they get the single most downvoted post in Reddit's entire history, when they said on Reddit that the reason they'd stuck most of the content in the game behind absolutely ridiculous grinds that you could bypass by putting your hands in your pocket and shelling out for an obscene amount of loot boxes, the reason they did it was in order to give you a sense of pride and accomplishment in spending 40 hours of your life playing the game just to get Darth Vader unlocked. Not only did mainstream media suddenly perk up their ears and pay attention, but there were congressional hearings and governments stepped in to investigate just exactly how far up your arse Electronic Arts were prepared to stick it in order to get you to hand over $5 for a loot box just to make the grind marginally less painful. Electronic Arts didn't just screw it for themselves, they screwed it for every other publisher on the planet. Suddenly, loot boxes were getting banned outright. Publishers were being taken to court by governments. And I don't know if you've seen it on YouTube, but there's a couple of video clips where some Electronic Arts, and extremely unfortunate, I mean, I've got no sympathy for them whatsoever, you know, they pick their bed. But some extremely unfortunate Electronic Arts mouthpiece was dragged up in front of either the US Senate or the US Congress for hearings. And it was glorious. It was so funny to watch, because as a direct result of Electronic Arts' excessive greed, the term loot box itself just became so tainted that clearly some kind of directive had come down from on high that they were never to officially use the term loot box. Instead, they were to refer to them as surprise mechanics. And it was glorious watching this EA shill at this official governmental hearing being questioned about loot boxes but not allowed to actually say loot box. They knew it was bullshit. They knew the people who were asking them the questions knew it was bullshit, but their job rested on their never actually using the phrase loot box during the entire course of this hearing. A hearing which, by the way, let me remind you, was convened especially for the single purpose of discussing Electronic Arts' overly aggressive use of loot boxes, during which the person being asked the questions about loot boxes had been told by her bosses to never use the term loot boxes and refer to them as surprise mechanics instead. Oh, and watching her squirm as she tried to dodge the questions. Oh, it was absolutely amazing. It's some of the funniest stuff I have ever seen on YouTube. So what's all this got to do with Phil Spencer over at Xbox? Well, it's nowhere near as bad as what Electronic Arts did, who, by the way, are still in court in numerous countries, vigorously defending their right to push gambling onto children, but, you know, that's Electronic Arts for you. It's not even as bad as what Wargaming did with the Puerto Rico. But I think it's still fairly safe to say that Phil Spencer, head of Microsoft Xbox, while he's absolutely not in the same league as Wargaming or Electronic Arts, he's very, very definitely still playing the same sport. So this is all to do with Redfall, developed by Arcane, yeah, the same people that did Dishonored. And I've never played Dishonored, but I hear it's pretty good. In fact, they do have a fairly solid track record, which is kind of surprising because their latest game, Redfall, is kind of bad. And that's it, by the way, that's all. It's just kind of bad. You know, there's no social or political agenda being pushed here. Nobody's trying to sell gambling to children. It's just not a very good game. Probably should give you a bit of context here. So, for those of you who don't know what Redfall is, it's a up to 4-player cooperative shooter where you hunt vampires and vampire cultists in a town that's been taken over by vampires. The clever bit is, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie 30 Days a Night or read the comic books upon which it's based, but there are certain places in the world at the high northern latitudes where in winter the sun goes down and it doesn't come up again for another 30 days. And this was the premise behind 30 Days a Night, because it basically meant that a bunch of vampires could isolate this town in Alaska, sabotage all their communications, shut down their power so they can't call for help from the outside world, and then it's 30 days of feeding time. It's basically vampire party bonanza. That was the idea behind 30 Days a Night, and they have something similar in Redfall. And as a concept, I thought that was great. The problem is it was executed not very well. Kind of badly, in fact. Specific examples, the AI is absolutely laughable. Get yourself onto YouTube and look up any gameplay footage from Redfall, and you will see the player walking right up to non-player characters, vampires and cultists, and they're just not reacting. In the middle of gunfights, half of the NPCs are just idly standing there scratching their arses. You know, what's that shooting noise? You know, that the AI is terrible. You can even reset them halfway through fights. I mean, it's comically bad. The idea that this was even remotely ready to be published is just hilarious. That's just one example. Although in a first-person shooter, it's probably the most important. But then there are other things. The whole idea that because I mean, you know, they're hunting vampires here, and the vampires have a bit of problem with sunlight. But whereas in the comics and movie, 30 Days a Night, there's a perfectly natural and logical explanation for why the sun doesn't come up for 30 days, because you're so far north and it's in the middle of winter. You can't really have that happen in a New England fishing village. It's not far north enough. So instead, they did some magic, and there's an eclipse and the sun, you know, whatever. It doesn't matter. The point is, they've thought about the vampire having this obvious vulnerability to sunlight, and they've come up with a way. They've waved their hands and made the problem of the sunlight go away. They've taken care of it. Except they didn't, because while you're playing, you can look up at the sun and see that it's eclipsed, but you're still standing in broad daylight. They didn't bother to adjust the lighting levels to account for the fact that this entire town is now covered by an eclipse. And I mean, that's not something that requires 6 months of development time to fix. You just change the lighting levels. But they didn't even do that. Again, though, I mean, you know, you have to put this whole thing into context. It's not an utter train wreck of a game. I mean, it's not Far Cry 6, all right? It's just not very good. There are so many things that are wrong with it that could have been fixed easily, but they just couldn't be bothered. Or that probably did require, like the AI, probably did require a few more months of playtesting and polishing and, you know, making it work at all. But they just published it anyway. And that, of course, is all down to Phil Spencer, head of Xbox, because they're the publisher. Now, to at least give Phil Spencer some credit, he has apologised for the shockingly bad state in which the game was released. But nobody gets to be the head of a major games publishing corporation by admitting to the truth and owning your mistakes, so of course, any apology is always going to come with a generous helping of lies and bullshit that together just render the actual apology completely insincere and meaningless. So, what did Phil Spencer have to say about Redfall? Well, the first hilarious lie was he said that delaying Redfall's release wouldn't have solved its most fundamental problems because while there are clearly quality issues, and that's kind of understating it a little, the bigger problem is that the game isn't realising the creative vision that it had for its players. He went on to say, that doesn't feel like a hey, just delay it. That feels like the game had a goal to do one thing, and when players are actually playing, they're not feeling that thing. They're not feeling the creative execution of the team. So what's this vision then, Phil? Well, he doesn't say what the vision is. He never at any point explains exactly what he's talking about. In exactly the same way that when Bobby Kotick of Activision was asked about the implications of AI in future game development, he started waffling on about Guitar Hero and embedded processors. But, well, not in exactly the same way, because in Bobby Kotick's case, he just didn't have an answer, but didn't want to look as if he didn't know absolutely everything about absolutely everything, and so he just dug himself into a stupid hole. But Phil Spencer's actually being quite smart here. He knows what he's doing. Because when you and I are sitting here thinking, what is this grand vision that the game didn't deliver? That's exactly what he wants you to think, because he doesn't want you to focus on the lies and bullshit in the first half of that statement. The whole part about, well, this isn't something that we could fix just by delaying it. It absolutely is something that you could have and should have fixed just by delaying it. Because the game doesn't fucking work. It's a first-person shooter, where the targets that you shoot at don't realise they're being shot at, and don't react to anything around them being shot at. That sounds to me like something that you absolutely could fix in a first-person shooter. You know, the first-person shooting could have been fixed by delaying it a few months. And then the whole issue with everything being in broad daylight when it's supposed to be in night due to an eclipse sounds like something you could have fixed by delaying it a day. Never mind a few months, but you didn't. You published it anyway, and it sucks. He then added insult to injury, and I'm not making this part up either, by going on to say that he was very surprised by all of the bad reviews. So you published a first-person shooter where the first-person shooting doesn't work. He then went on to say, without directly referring to things like this, by the way, he just called them quality issues, went on to say that none of these quality issues could have been fixed by delaying the game, because the only real problem that the game had was that the developer didn't deliver on the vision for the game without actually saying what that vision is. Or in other words, he's throwing the developers, Arcane, under the bus here. He's saying that the developers didn't deliver on the vision of the game. Doesn't say what that vision is, but it's the developers' fault because they didn't deliver on it. It's not the publisher's fault, you know, your fault for publishing a game that clearly needed another 6 months' work because there was nothing in the game that could have been fixed by delaying it another 6 months, aside from, you know, making the first-person shooting work in a first-person shooter. That clearly couldn't have been fixed with another 6 months. It's all the developer. Arcane didn't deliver on this vision. What vision's this, Phil? Are you having a Bobby Kotick moment? Are you going to start waffling on about Guitar Hero and embedded processors? You know, we had an expression for this sort of thing in the Navy. We called it bullshit baffles brains. It's a very simple concept and it absolutely works. Well, it works most of the time. I mean, it works often enough that it's worth using as a tactic. So what is bullshit baffles brains? Well, let's say, for example, your ship's having captain's rounds, which involves the ship being cleaned from top to bottom to within an inch of its life in order for the captain to walk around and inspect everything. Now, the captain himself doesn't actually inspect anything. It's all of his entourage that follow him around that poke into the corners and look for dirt and dust everywhere. But you can distract them with bullshit. So the idea is they're looking around to make sure that everything's clean and hygienic. But if, when they come in to inspect your mess deck, and you're standing there reporting the mess deck to the inspecting officer, in this case the captain, what if you've got a cake on the mess deck table for the inspection team? They're going to spend more time eating the cake than poking around in all the nooks and crannies. So if there's anything that you've missed, there's less chance they're going to find it. Because they don't have all day to check your mess deck. I mean, they've got to check every other mess deck, every flat, every passageway, every engineering compartment. So they've got to check the whole ship. So any time spent eating your cake is less time spent inspecting your mess deck. It does work. Phil Spencer is a master of the art of bullshit baffles brain. Because he is full of shit. But he's baffled your brain, because now you're sitting there thinking, what vision? What are you talking about? When you should be pressing him on the point that he lied about when he said that the quality issues with the game couldn't be fixed by delaying it 3 to 6 months. Well, they absolutely 100% could and should. And it's not Arcane's fault for delivering a bad game. It's Xbox's fault for publishing a bad game that could have been a good game if it had been published when it was ready. Now, in some cases, the developer and the publisher are one and the same. So, you know, in that case, there's absolutely no excuse. And yes, CD Projekt Red and Cyberpunk 2077, I am looking at you here. But I feel in this case, while Arcane definitely have a responsibility to produce a game that works as advertised on time and on budget, when it's not on time and it's not on budget and it doesn't work as advertised and the publisher publishes it anyway, it does kind of look like the publisher is throwing the developer under the bus here and wiping their hands of any responsibility, because according to Phil Spencer, the decision to publish, because he's the publisher, remember, the decision to publish a broken and unfinished game is not the fault of the publisher. That's all down to the developer, because they didn't deliver on their vision. Well, when you say it like that, Phil, it all makes perfect sense. So I guess the one big takeaway from this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles is that games publishers are scum, and you can always tell when they're lying, because their lips are moving. Join me in next week's episode of Mingles with Jingles, where I reveal the shocking news that despite what you may have been led to believe all these years, water is in fact actually wet. So, I know. It all seems kind of obvious, really, doesn't it? Anyway, like I said, it has been a bit of a slow news week. I haven't actually done an awful lot this week, but I somehow still managed to find the time to spend 25 minutes talking about games publishers being scumbags. Because games publishers generally are scumbags. It's funny, it's like the bigger they get, the more scumbaggy they become. And the tipping point is usually when they become a publicly traded company. Because then the people in charge aren't really in charge anymore. They have to answer to a board of directors. And the only thing the board of directors care about is the money. Which is interesting, actually, because Wargaming is not a public company. It's still a privately owned company. So they don't even have that excuse. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. Somehow it all ends up coming back to Wargaming, doesn't it? Anyway, I think I've kicked the arse out of this one. That is it for this week. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope I've given you something to think about and maybe talk about in the comments. And as always, I hope you all have a great week. I hope you all had a great weekend. Take care, and I'll catch you next time.